I'm Daniel Levine, and this is the Bio Report. The market for orphan drugs is growing at more than twice the rate of other prescription medicines. In 2013, a record 260 therapeutics won orphan designations in the United States alone, as science, policy, and pricing are fueling the trend for drug makers to develop expensive drugs for small patient populations. We spoke to Jon Gardner, author of a new report from EvaluatePharma about the growth of the orphan drug market, how successful drug makers have been at expanding the use of these drugs for non-orphan indications, and whether growing pricing pressure will lead to disruptions in the market for these products. Jon, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
In a new report, you're forecasting that the orphan drug market will reach $176 billion by 2020, representing nearly 20% of total prescription drug sales, not counting generics. Not only that, but this segment of the drug market is expected to grow at more than twice the 5% growth rate of the overall prescription drug market, excluding generics. For the sake of our listeners, perhaps you can begin just by explaining what we mean by orphan drugs.
Sure. An orphan drug is one that's been designated as such by regulators in the U.S., Europe, or Japan, and sometimes, a lot of the times, all three, as serving an unmet need in a rare disease. Each region has its own designation, but for reference, U.S. law establishes it as one that affects fewer than 200,000 people in the U.S.
Now, the Orphan Drug Act in the United States and similar legislation elsewhere has played a role in driving the growth of orphan drugs. What are the incentives the Orphan Drug Act provides drug makers, and how big a role do you think that's had in the growth of this segment?
The Drug Act provides tax credits, first of all, tax credits to offset R&D costs. And then when a drug has succeeded in clinical trials, it waives the user fees on regulatory filings in the U.S., which makes orphan drugs much less expensive to develop. So this has led to a dramatic rise in the number of orphan designations, including in the last decade or so, a doubling in the number of approvals per year. So in 2013, 260 drugs were designated as orphans.
Well, there's been a growing interest in orphan drugs among drug makers, a departure from the days of the traditional blockbuster drug model. Part of that comes from these incentives, but I'm wondering, have you seen other factors that have fueled this trend? What's brought about the change, and what else is driving that growth? Is it science? Is it development time and cost? Is it pricing?
Sure, there's a number of factors. First of all, we've seen a rapid evolution in understanding of human biology in the last 20 years or so, which has helped to reveal druggable targets and diseases that once seemed intractable. And then once a researcher has identified a target and a suitable drug to address the underlying biological dysfunction, if you will, it's much less expensive to develop an orphan drug, as I explained before, not just because the tax incentives, but also because you have a smaller population, so the trial sizes are much smaller. On average, the development period will take about as long as a non-orphan drug. But then once you've submitted your application to the regulatory agencies, it tends to be shorter because it tends to be shorter from approval, from submission to decision, because the regulators are actually keen to get these products on the market. So all this means, all these factors mean that drug makers have a much better return on investment in the orphan sphere. They're just simply more profitable drugs.
And is there any way to quantify, in terms of the development time or cost?
The development cost is somewhere around, anywhere from 25 to 50% of a non-orphan drug, simply because then that's factoring in the tax incentives to your ability to write off the R&D costs. In terms of the regulatory submission time, it's if that was the question, it's somewhere around the area of a 2-month benefit that you have by submitting an orphan drug to the regulators on average.
That's because of the faster review time.
Because of faster review time, yes.
And in terms of pricing, you alluded to better pricing, but can we quantify that in any way? How much better are the prices a drug maker can command for an orphan drug?
Well, as an example, the famous drug of all in the orphan sphere is this drug Soliris, which for a very small indication of fewer than 2,000 people has approximately the list price on it is $600,000. On average, an orphan drug, and it depends on whether you measure it by average or median, but on average, the price is right about $100,000 for an orphan drug.
And yet, NICE, which is the UK's watchdog on drug pricing, approved use of the drug, didn't they?
They did indeed, and that's because NICE is fairly rigorous or reasonably rigorous in its data, and there is a benefit. It is shown to be the maker Alexion Pharmaceuticals was able to actually show that the benefit in terms of patient quality of life more than offset the cost of the drug.
Well, Bristol Myers Squibb is set to become the largest seller of orphan drugs in 2020 on the strength of its cancer immunotherapy, Opdivo. In a sense, we've had a broadening of the world of orphan drugs through the advent of targeted therapies, particularly in cancer. To what extent are we now defining diseases as orphan indications that previously hadn't been thought of that way?
Well, what has happened in many cases is a drug maker will seek approval in an orphan indication first, in part because of the advantages that we've discussed before of doing so. Once approval has been achieved, then they will expand into non-orphan indications. This is common in cancer and immunotherapy, in particular, where a particular molecule might have effects throughout the disease process and can modulate various aspects of various diseases. This is a very cost-effective strategy for achieving approval, and for less well-capitalized biotech firms, is a very attractive one.
Well, your study notably excluded a number of drugs that were first approved as orphan drugs, but now derive more than 25% of their sales from non-orphan indications. This includes drugs like Avastin and Enbrel and Herceptin, Humira, Remicade. Is there any way to quantify overall what percentage of orphan drug sales are for non-orphan indications, and how does this shape the development strategy of drug makers?
Well, we have a definition of orphan drugs in this analysis because of this issue of rather large drugs like Humira, the world's largest selling drug, having orphan indications. So we sort of decided that an orphan drug, in order to be included in this analysis, has to look like an orphan drug. So amongst the factors that go into this is first, indication for an orphan condition, as an example. Products that are expected to generate more than 25% of sales from the orphan indications. A small trial size would suggest an orphan status, or or oftentimes, as we discussed before, the pricing. So this means that in this analysis, the drugs have to have derived more than 25% of their sales from orphan indications.
So, I mean, you spoke a minute ago about the strategy of targeting an orphan indication initially and then broadening it. There are some great examples of that, but how easy is that to do? How successful have drug makers been at finding an orphan indication that they can then expand into non-orphan indications?
Well, I think the world of immunology is a good one because you can have diseases, and I wouldn't necessarily hold me to this, where ankylosing spondylitis is one where you might have a very effective drug that can address an orphan indication, very small population, but the same sort of inflammatory markers then lend themselves to rheumatoid arthritis. So okay, go ahead.
No, I'm wondering if, as the Orphan Drug Act has not been without its controversies, right, as companies have been able to successfully expand the indications of a drug from orphan to non-orphan, is that putting more pressure on policymakers or on drug makers in regards to the Orphan Drug Act? Does that present any kind of a challenge to its existence?
It is, and I think that there have been some revisions to the Orphan Drug Act in the regulations of the Orphan Drug Act in the past year or so, that essentially what they wanted to keep companies from doing is, I think in the terms of the regulation, as I read them, slicing the bologna too thin. That is identifying patient populations that are, because of certain molecular biological factors, are a subset within a subset within a subset, and then getting an orphan indication. And they've tightened up the regulations on that a little bit, and there doesn't seem to have been any severe fallout from that. But I would imagine that the reason that the regulators did that is because they saw the danger of it for precisely this reason.
Well, we've spoke mostly about the U.S., but are there significant difference in the growth of orphan drugs in other developed markets like Europe or Japan?
It's a very similar picture. There have been some differences in terms of statistical, numbers of approvals in Europe and Japan in the past year or so. But indeed, all these in all of the regions there have been an increase in orphan designations, and indeed it's been a similar trend line in which the last 10 years has seen an increase in applications, designations, and cumulative number of designations.
Well, at a time when there's growing scrutiny on drug prices, how much of an advantage can drug makers gain from orphan drugs? How are payers viewing these drugs as they look at containing the rising cost of specialty pharmaceuticals?
This is a good question, because specialty pharmaceuticals, which are those often defined as costing more than $3,000 a month, or biologicals that have to be infused in a healthcare facility, are in fact coming under increased scrutiny. What has happened, a difference that's happened in the past 2 years or so, is that we're seeing non-orphan drugs essentially seeking orphan prices. We will see, I remember that I mentioned the $100,000 price point from earlier. This is approximately the price point that Gilead Pharmaceuticals has brought out its hepatitis C drugs, Sovaldi and Harvoni, which address a population of 3.2 million people. However, in every case, this $3,000 a month or more biologicals, this includes orphan drugs in almost every case, and they too are feeling the same pressure and having to justify their prices, and they're feeling this pressure to keep costs in line now, I believe. And it would be to the detriment of people with orphan conditions if they had to as a result of changes in benefit structures, had to pay more out of pocket because of this new trend, because their drugs are indeed different and their diseases are indeed different.
Well, as you look at the pipeline, how big a portion of that is made up of orphan drugs, and how compelling are the drugs in the late-stage clinical trials?
That would be probably very difficult to quantify. However, I think it's safe to say that, as I mentioned earlier, we are seeing this ability to identify new druggable targets and come up with molecules or biologicals that can address those conditions. The number of designations, the rise in the number of designations in the last 10 years is a good indicator of that. A near doubling in annual designations since 2003, I believe it is. So I think that we will see some new interesting drugs come out and some conditions that are unmet, perhaps a disease like Huntington's or Parkinson's, where there are aspects of Parkinson's where we really haven't treated the disease very well, and it may add significantly to the quality of life of the patients that have those conditions.
The trend is pretty clear, but do you see any threats out there to the health of the orphan drug market from payers or regulators or policymakers?
I think that indeed this question of pricing is going to become abundantly clear in the next few years. Specialty drugs are going to represent 50% of drug spending in by the year 2018. The private payers are already looking at it very closely. In the case of regulators and policymakers, with the advent of the subsidized health insurance plans under the Affordable Care Act and also the Medicaid expansions under the Affordable Care Act, the pressure is only going to get stronger.
Jon Gardner, Deputy News Editor of EP Vantage. Jon, thanks as always.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for listening. The Bio Report is a production of the Levine Media Group. To automatically download this podcast each week, subscribe to our RSS feed or through iTunes or other podcast manager. To join our mailing list, go to levinemediagroup.com. We'd love to hear from you. If you want to drop us a line or are interested in sponsoring this podcast, send an email to danny@levinemediagroup.com. Special thanks to Jonah Levine, who composed our theme music, and the Jonah Levine Collective, which performs it.